Okay, so here's just a really quick demonstration of how the Victron smart batteries work. So we've got here our BMS. It's got these communication wires that make a loop through all the batteries. So the battery communications just plug end to end all the way through the bank. It doesn't matter the series and parallel for the communications. Obviously, series and parallel matters for voltage and everything else, but for the communications, it doesn't matter. You just go all the way through the bank, making a complete loop back to the BMS. The wires, there are three wires in this communication loop. They're titled ATC, ATD, and pre-alarm. That stands for allowed to charge, allowed to discharge, and pre-alarm. This is a simple continuity-based communications loop. So under normal operation, when everything's good, each battery allows continuity through on these three wires. So if the BMS sees that it has continuity from ATC here on the output to the ATC here on the input, then it knows that every single battery is passing continuity through. So then it knows, hey, the batteries are all telling me that it's okay to charge. Same with the ATD. If all the batteries are passing continuity through the ATD, then BMS knows, okay, it's okay to discharge. And same with pre-alarm. If any one of the batteries throws a pre-alarm where it's saying, hey, there's an imminent shutdown coming, then it will disconnect the pre-alarm, and the BMS will see that there's no continuity from pre-alarm to pre-alarm, and so then it'll throw a pre-alarm alert. So it's just a dead simple communication scheme. Now the new NG series, the new generation series batteries, they use the same communication cable, but it's using more of a more complete communication protocol. So I don't, it's not exactly published what they're using, but it might be something like CAN. So they're using the same cables, but then the BMS is actually receiving data like cell voltages and cell temperatures and all of that. But in this case, the BMS, it's only reading, is it okay to charge? Is it okay to discharge? And is there a pre-alarm? And so then the BMS handles all of that. Now, if we've got the VE direct, sorry, I meant to say if we've got the VE bus BMS version 2, then in that case, it tells the GX device, like the servo, to stop charging, for example. And then that way the servo can then tell the charge controllers to stop charging. And so we've got a really great system there where you don't need to have switches and all this stuff on all of those things. But if you have DC loads that don't receive communication from the servo, then you do need to have essentially a solid state relay or a Victron battery protect. The Victron battery protect is basically just a fancy solid state relay, or you could even use a simple DC contactor. And this BMS has a port, an ATD port, allowed to discharge port. And when everything's okay to discharge, it puts battery power, battery voltage to that ATD port. So then that ATD port powers the remote on-off terminal on the battery protect or a solid state relay or a mechanical contactor, and that allows the DC load to run. And then if the BMS hears from the batteries that it's time to that they can that they need to stop discharging, then it will immediately interrupt that battery voltage to here. Then this will turn off the DC load, and that protects your batteries from over discharge. One of the things I like about this scheme is the inverter is constantly powered to connected to the battery no matter what. And so if the inverter receives a command to where it's no longer allowed to discharge, then it turns off, but it turns off into charge only mode. So if the so it's not drawing any power from the battery, but then if you start a generator or something like that, connect it to the grid, plug in shore power, what have you, then the inverter will power up off of the power supply on that AC input, and then it'll see that it's not allowed to discharge, but it is allowed to charge. And so then it'll utilize that AC source to start charging and power up the system. The where this can fail is if the batteries get so deeply discharged that the BMS itself has to turn off, then the inverter might not be able to power up. But that's why there's a GX power port. The GX power port will supply power to your smart shunt. It'll supply power to your servo. It'll supply power to all those things. And so after the ATD terminal shuts off, the BMS will keep those other communications devices live for a while, for a certain amount of time. But if the battery gets so low that it needs to even turn those off, then it'll turn those off to preserve that last little bit in the batteries so that the inverter will still be able to turn on and charge up the batteries if you start a generator or something like that. So that's a basic scheme of how all this works. Most of this does not apply to the NG series, partly because the NG series currently only has a Lynx BMS. The Lynx BMS has a shunt built in. It has a contactor built in. It has all these things built in a nice little package. It's part of why it's so expensive. This is obviously a lot cheaper with all these individual components, but then it's more individual components to wire up. So yeah, I hope this little demonstration is helpful, and thank you.